Hello, we're back again looking at the doctrine of the church, and we're talking about who the church is. Today we want to look at a couple little side steps from that. Number one, we want to look at what the church or who the church is not. And then we also want to look at the relationship of Israel and the church and just give you a quick introduction to covenantalism and dispensationalism, something we will get into much more deeply when we talk about last things. But for the moment, we want to begin with what the church is not. First of all, and I would hope this is obvious to everyone, the church is not a building. We don't go to church. That's kind of a bad way of saying it, even though it's so popular that we're never going to change it. We go to be with the church is the proper way we should be thinking. The church is a living, breathing people. The church is a living thing, not a building, not an inanimate thing, and not a place. The church is a people. Even though we use the language of going to church, and like I said, it's so popular that we're never going to change it. Probably won't even change it in our own lives because we've grown up with it or it's just ingrained as part of who we are. That should not be what we mean. And I hope that makes sense to you. We can say we're going to church, but what we really mean is we're going to be with the church. We have all these beautiful buildings and all these beautiful places, and they're just buildings. They're just brick or wood or stone or steel or whatever they're built out of. They can be torn down, they can be replaced. What makes them special is who meets there. The people of God meet in this building, and that makes it special. But the building in and of itself has no special qualities other than either being, too big or too small or nice or not nice enough, or any of the other things that buildings are. They can be replaced, they can be rebuilt, they can be whatever. But the church is not a building, the church is a people. Another thing that we need to look at, and this again is my Free Church Baptist roots coming out, the church is not a part of or synonymous with the state. For most of Christian existence, church and state have been in lockstep with one another, if not so inextricably intertwined that they couldn't be separated. That's been the reality from the universal reality from the early 4th century up into the 16th, and remains reality in many places even today. But true Christianity, as I've written here, has such a huge inward component that it can never be truly regulated or utilized for political or worldly purposes. You just can't regulate the church by the state. It's just not subject to state regulation. There's conscience, there's will, there's things that laws, at least civil laws, can't touch. And mixture between church and state, in my opinion, has been trouble for the faith without fail in the history of the world. So that when we talk about folks today who want to reunite church and state, such as Christian Reconstructionists or Dominionists or any other wing of folks like that, I just want to say no, don't you know your history? Don't you know your history? Because when they go together, as far as I can tell, it's just nothing but trouble. The church also is not a denomination, and the church is not restricted to a single denomination. And I'm sure you've heard the jokes that when you tour heaven, they give you heaven, a guided tour of heaven, and they open up one room, and here are the Methodists, and they open up another room, here are the Presbyterians, and then whoever the butt of the joke is, they say, shh, they're in there, but they think they're the only ones here. I'm sure you've heard that joke. But the church is not a denomination, and it cannot be encapsulated by any denomination. Even though there are maybe some doctrinal disagreements that result in separate denominations, we cannot say that any one Christian denomination has everything either totally right or totally wrong. If it's Christian, it's got some of both. Maybe more of one than another, or maybe we'll find one may be more tasteful than another. But every denomination has its pluses and its minuses. and we just have to be able to learn to live with that. The church is not the kingdom itself, although they are interdependent and parallel. The church moves in and out of the kingdom, but the church itself is not the kingdom. The kingdom is something that exists not only in this world, but in God's world. The church exists in this world and exists, well, I guess you could say that the church also exists in God's world, that his people are there. But at this moment, the kingdom is not fully realized yet. So they run in the same circles, but they're not exactly the same thing. Finally, the church is not a parachurch organization. Parachurch organizations, for example, things like Campus Crusade, Focus on the Family, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Samaritan's Purse, things like that. They exist to fulfill some of the functions of the church. We'll talk about that later. And sometimes do these functions more smoothly than the church can do. But they are not the church. They're not the church themselves and never can be. They do not have the authority structure or the marks of the church, and we'll talk about those in a later video too. Although they do some of the same things that the church does. They fulfill part of the church's function, but they do not. They are not a church and can never be. Quickly now, how do the church in Israel relate? I'm just going to go over this very quick because it will be dealt with more when we talk about eschatology. Two answers, covenantal and dispensational. These are two frameworks in which we understand how the church in Israel relate. Covenantal is very common among the Reformed wing of Protestantism. It sees the church as a continuation of Israel, and sometimes a replacement, but not always, but definitely continuation of Israel as God's people. Thus, all the promises God made to Israel are fulfilled in Christ in the church. As Jewish baby boys were circumcised as infants to show they were a member of Abraham's covenant, covenant children within covenantal framework baptize their babies to show that they are also visible members of the covenant. At its core, covenant theology emphasizes a radical continuation between the testaments, a radical continuity between the church and Israel. On the other side is dispensationalism. Almost it's 180-degree opposite. This is very common in the Arminian-influenced wing of Protestantism, but not all of it, including fundamentalists, Pentecostals, and others. It sees the church as something brand new in God's vision and God's plan, completely separate from Israel. Whereas covenantalists have this continuity, dispensationalists have this radical discontinuity. The Old Testament promises must be closely analyzed if the intended recipient is either the church or Israel. It could be one or the other. And more often than not, it is Israel. No real connection between circumcision and baptism. See, the key thought here is this radical discontinuity. So that at its core, dispensationalism emphasizes this radical break in God's revelatory plan between Israel and the church. Now, that's really all I need to say about that right now, because we'll talk more about that when we get to eschatology. But it's good to see it introduced, because this idea of radical continuity or radical discontinuity between the church and Israel, it is good to know with when we begin to discuss what the church does and how the church functions and how it's governed. So I just wanted to introduce those topics to you in case you'd never heard them before. If you have, great. But if not, we'll dig more and deeply into them later. That's going to do us for now. When we come back later, we will talk about the church as the people of God in history, how the church has been viewed and how the church has done down through time. So I hope this has been helpful so far. We'll be digging into history, which is one of my favorite subjects next. And everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.